Hello, Tim.
Hello, Catherine, and good evening, everybody. Yes, Beaujolais. So I was talking about Bordeaux last week, and now I have to change my hat for Beaujolais. I took over Beaujolais buying 3 years ago, I think it is, from Toby Morgan. And actually, it makes a very interesting contrast to buying Bordeaux. It's chalk and cheese, really, in terms of the way the buying takes place, and also the whole topography and the people making the wines. So in Bordeaux, as you probably know, you get a lot of big chateaus with people in jackets and ties. Well, that's quite rare in Beaujolais. Generally, it's you're dealing with farmers who are spending half their time in the vineyards and the other half of their time in the winery. So you're really dealing with people who are at the coalface, if you like. So I thought to start off, just to give you a little overview of Beaujolais in general, because we're actually talking about the Cru Beaujolais this evening, and I just wanted to talk about a little bit about the other region of Beaujolais. So you can see the map in front of you. Hopefully it's large enough to make out. The map on the left shows you where Beaujolais is on the map of France. So you can see it's to the eastern side of the country, about halfway down, very roughly. Basically, it stretches from Lyon in the south to Macon towards the north. So the pink bit that you see towards the bottom, there's a town there called Villefranche-sur-Saône. So really south of Villefranche, you've got Beaujolais and Beaujolais Village, which are the two regional appellations, as they're called. And those are the more, shall we say, more modest wines for generally younger drinking, made from Gamay, which is the red grape variety of Beaujolais. And there's also quite a bit of white wine, relatively, grown in the south, which is Chardonnay. So wines that are a little bit similar in style to Macon further north. But where the serious action is above Villefranche. There are 10 villages that are called Cru, or Cru Beaujolais is. These are the best sites and historically where the best wines have come from. They tend to be wines that keep a bit longer than Beaujolais and Beaujolais Village. There are exceptions. But each village kind of has its own character. Each cru has its own character. So what I'm going to try and do tonight is to point out some of the main features of these cru. And I'm going to be focusing particularly on the better known cru, although I will touch on the lesser known ones as well, because I think it's important that they're not forgotten. So the first thing to talk about before I go on to talk about Fleury, which is the first cru we're going to come to, is soil. So soil is something that has a relatively important influence on the wines. So Beaujolais has probably the most diverse of all the regions, wine regions of France, has a very, very diverse range of soils, which we'll come to. But there was a massive survey that took place from, I think it was 2009 to 2018, where a company was charged with mapping all the soils of Beaujolais. And they produced some beautiful maps, color-coded maps with all the different soils of the Beaujolais region. And I think there were 15,000 soil surveys, and they identified over 300 soil types. So it really is very, very complex. And each soil adds a nuance to the taste of the wine. So the photograph that you can now see in front of you is from one of the producers that I deal with. It's called Chateau du Moulin d'Eole, who has vineyard mainly in Moulin-Avant. So there is an idea just in Philippe Guérin's vineyard, how many different soil types he's got, and he's only got, I think he's got 10 hectares or thereabouts. So you can see, actually, yes, he's got 10 hectares of Moulin Avant. He's got, how many profiles is that? 2, 4, 6, 8 different soil profiles just in his vineyard. Of course, he doesn't make 8 different wines, although I guess he could do, and each of them would probably express the individuality of each soil. And if we carry on down to the next map, you'll see that this is one of the macro maps, if you like. So this is the whole of Beaujolais mapped out, and the kind of pink soils and the red soils are kind of granite, and the green ones are more kind of schist and other slate, that kind of thing. And if we go down to the next map, you'll see it actually for the individual villages. And you can see the left-hand map is Fleury, mainly pink, and that's because Fleury is mainly pink granite soil. The right-hand is much more diverse and much broader spectrum of soils, and that's Moulin Avant. So really, I just included these maps just to show you, in a relatively small village like Fleury or Moulin Avant, just how diverse the soils are. So Burgundy had these maps done many years ago, but this is actually relatively new in Beaujolais. The overall character of Beaujolais, as I say, it comes from the Gamay grape, are supple wines, fruity wines generally, relatively low in alcohol, although you do occasionally see 14%. The vast majority of wines are 12.5 or 13 in most vintages. In warm vintages, it can go higher, but one of the facets, I think, one of the interesting characters of the Gamay grape is that it doesn't get over alcoholic. And really, to get the best expression of the Gamay grape, you want freshness and perfume. You don't want concentration, particularly. You find that further south in the Rhone. So you get fruit characters of kind of cherries and raspberries and strawberries. This is just a kind of bit of a generalization. But the other thing that's really interesting about the Gamay grape is that you get really good acidity. And its acidity, it's got natural acidity, the Gamay grape, and that's what gives the wine a lovely freshness, and it allows it makes the wines very good for food matching. Really nice acidity gives the wine balance, and there's a word that the French use often to describe wines, which is digeste, and it just means digestible, really. So it means that a wine that's digeste is one that's easy to drink with food, and you don't feel after one glass that you've had enough. You can very easily polish off a bottle of Beaujolais for 2 people, obviously within the guidelines of the chief medical officer, but they are wines that are for drinking and for enjoying with food. So that's a kind of overall picture of Beaujolais. I suppose I could tell you that the climate is, because it's in central France, it's semi-continental, the climate, but it's quite temperate. You do get snow and frost in winter, and it does get quite warm in summer, but it's tempered by the Saône River that runs kind of north to south on the eastern side of Beaujolais. The other thing I should talk about, actually, before we really get into the nitty-gritty, is actually the kind of vines that they have. So if we go on to the next picture, you'll see a rather attractive, sunny view of some bush vines in, there's a clue there, the windmill, Moulin Avant. So these are some old vines in Château des Jacques, which is one of the top properties in Moulin Avant. And you can see that the vines are individual bush vines. and they're planted at quite high concentration. And that's one of the typical characters of Beaujolais is bush vines. Very high concentration of vines. You can get up to 10,000 vines in 1 hectare, which means that it's very, very expensive to make the wine. You can imagine when you've got bush vines, you can't mechanize anything, because if you try and get a tractor, even a kind of narrow tractor into the vineyard, you would damage the vines. And that's been one of the challenges for Beaujolais in recent years, particularly down in the south, where the laws said you needed to have a minimum concentration of vines. They needed to be bush vines. And of course, you know, when you're producing Beaujolais or Beaujolais Village, you can't charge a great deal for your wine. And so a lot of people have gone out of business. I'm pleased to say that the laws have changed now so that you can actually plant less high concentration of vines. You're permitted by the appellation body. But the other thing you can do, and the next picture will demonstrate this, is you can actually start trellising your vines. There you go. So this is actually also a vineyard that's in Moulin, Château des Jacques. And there you've got the vines on wires, and that makes it much easier to mechanize. And it means that you can get a tractor in the vineyard. You can actually see, if you look very closely, if you've got this on a big screen, you can actually see tractor tracks between the vines. So that demonstrates why quite a lot of producers have moved from bush vines to trellised vines. Okay, therein ends the lesson. I'm now going to talk less generally and a little bit more about the vineyard regions. So the most popular of all the vineyard regions is Fleury, and everybody knows Fleury. So Fleury is towards the north of the Crus. I don't know if a picture is available, but yes, here we go. So there'll be a nice picture, there you go, of that's the vineyards of Fleury. So you can see nice rolling, gentle slopes. You can just make out a church in the background. Well, that is the village of Fleury, which is a very pretty little village with 1 or 2 nice restaurants. I should say that Beaujolais in general is a lovely region to visit. So when we are all allowed to visit, and I haven't been there for over a year now, it is a lovely place to visit. The cuisine's excellent. The people are very friendly, and it's topographically and geographically, it's more interesting actually than Burgundy is a bit further north. Anyway, what are the typical facets of Fleury? Well, Fleury, as the name, Fleury means flowery, basically in French, and the typical character of Fleury is kind of fragrant, floral, perfumed, quite silky, with delicate tannins. Beaujolais tends to have low tannin, partly because of the method of production, and partly because the Gamay grape is quite thin-skinned and doesn't have a lot of tannin in the skins. So Fleury is all about fragrance and perfume and easy drinking, and it's and that's why it's become so popular in this country. Some of the Fleury vineyards are not as gently sloping as that lovely summer picture you see there where the vines are in leaf. But if we go on to the next picture, you'll see a slightly more grim-looking Fleury. So this was when I visited, I think it was in January one year. So you can see obviously there's no leaves on the vines, but you can see how steep it gets. The chapel at the top is the famous La Madone chapel, and that's one of the real landmarks of Fleury. So when you go to Fleury, that is a rather imposing site overlooking the vineyards and overlooking the village of Fleury. And you can see the bush vines very clearly there. They're planted at high density, and you can see there's some very, very steep slopes there. And you actually get two different styles of fleury. On the more gentle slopes, with the slightly deeper soils, because you can imagine the soil tends to erode and wash down to the bottom of the slopes. You get, I guess, slightly fuller, more structured fleuries that age for quite a long time. So we deal with Clos de la Roilette, which we'll come to shortly, and he's not right up on the top. He's lower down and has slightly deeper soils, and his wines are fuller bodied and maybe less lightweight or less elegant, but they keep a bit longer than some of the wines further up the slope. The wines produced higher up, where the soils are a bit thinner, where I suppose you could say the climate is cooler. It's significantly cooler as you go up the hill. Then you get a lighter, more perfumed, elegant style of fleury. And in our selection, I try and offer both wines. So I have got a fleury in front of me. If we go on to the next picture, you'll see a picture of Gregoire Hoppenot. Now, Gregoire is new into the fleury or into the winemaking game. So he worked for one of the big wine companies, but always harbored a passion to produce his own wine. And he decided to basically jack it in and start his own winery. And he wrote to me actually in 2018 and told me what he was doing, because I'd met him once before. And I went to visit him, and that's when I took that picture. And since then, we've taken his wines where we bought the 2018, which was his first vintage, and we've also bought the 19. This is a picture of the label, which is quite a sweet picture. It's a painting of Gregoire's kids, basically. But I was delighted that he was voted newcomer of the year by France's most influential wine magazine, and the equivalent of Decanter, basically. It's called the Revue de Vin de France. And they voted him last year as the most promising newcomer. And he makes very authentic wines. The particular wine I'm tasting now is a lighter, more easy drinking style. But it has lovely freshness, lovely perfume, quite light. But it's 2019, the vintage that I'm drinking, so it's already approachable, very drinkable. It's got, as I talked about earlier, it's got that lovely freshness, that nice acidity that Gamay gives. 2019 was actually quite a warm vintage, but it didn't really affect this wine. This tastes fresh. The alcohol is 12.5%, so it is a wine that you can finish the bottle quite happily of an evening. So that, for me, is a kind of typical, absolutely benchmark fleury.
It seems, Tim, that a lot of people may have agreed with you, because it is now actually out of stock. So is this one that you will likely be looking to have back on the future vintage?
I bought a pallet and a half, and that was all he had. I'm hoping he'll give me a bit more next year. But we have another wine from Gregoire, which we will be offering later this year, which is a more serious wine. It's called Les Mauriers, which is one of the vineyards, one of the good vineyards in Fleury. So the one that I'm trying now is a mixture of different vineyards from Fleury. This is the Fleury Les Mauriers is, I can't quite remember when we're offering it, but I will. We can confirm that maybe afterwards, Catherine.
Yes, let's watch this space.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one if you want a good benchmark fleury, then the Society's exhibition fleury is always a good bet. It's won wine champions probably, I think, 3 years out of the last 4. So, and that's a wine that we get through Aujoux, who's our main supplier of own label Beaujolais, and every year I go down. Well, I didn't go down this year because I'm not allowed to, but I was sent a load of samples and blended the wine along with their winemaker. But the great thing about being able to blend the Wine Society's wines is that you can use constituents from lots of different parts of the appellation in order to get a really typical wine. So I try and make a wine that is very typical of Fleury and is nice, easy drinking, and that you can finish the bottle.
Excellent. That leads us quite nicely into a question we've had in, sort of talking about the typicity of Beaujolais and of the different crus, and also talking about how 2019 was a warm vintage. The question's from Robert Stanya. He's asked, as a buyer, are you pleased when it's been a warm vintage, as the recent vintages have been, or do you think it removes the typicity, or is there a risk of it removing the typicity?
That is an excellent question. And one of my biggest concerns for Beaujolais is hot vintages. And there are an increasing number of hot vintages. So it is a very apposite question, because I think Beaujolais' biggest challenge is climate change. And when you deal with good growers who know what they're doing, even in hot vintages, they can make wines that are refreshing. But the problem with Beaujolais is that when it's really hot, the wines take on an almost Rhone-like quality. 2015 was one such vintage. I wasn't buying the 15. It was the vintage before I joined, but Toby was buying the 15 vintage, and he did a very good job of identifying which of the wines were more Rhone-like and which were more Beaujolais-like, depending on where they came from, what the soils were like, what the elevation of the vineyards were like. But I'm quite pleased I didn't inherit that vintage, because it was actually quite a difficult vintage, although it was lauded as one of the great vintages of Beaujolais. I have to say I disagree, because what Beaujolais for me is about freshness. And I talked about wines that are digest earlier, wines that are easy to drink. That for me is the essence of Beaujolais. If you go a bit further north to Burgundy, Pinot Noir is not great when it's from a really, really hot vintage. So it's exactly the same. It's a delicate vine, and the nuances of Beaujolais and the nuances of Burgundy, I think, are to an extent lost in really hot vintages.
Absolutely. Excellent.
Okay. So that's Fleury. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to Moulin Avant. Moulin Avant is one of the famous cru. Its sales are probably second to Fleury. If we we'll just go down to slide 13, please. Well, there's Claude Laroy. That's Alain Couder, who is the maker of one of the best Fleuries, I think. So I think I referred to him earlier. He makes a classic style in a slightly fuller body. You can see behind him are some what are called foudres. He makes the wines in a very traditional way in these big oak foudres for aging the wine. Those are the very traditional sort of receptacles, if you like, for aging the wine. If you actually go on to the next slide from that, there's the corollary. There is the opposite side of the coin, the reverse side of the coin. So this is Chateau des Jacques, where they do use some wood, but they also have some state-of-the-art kind of stainless steel tanks. Obviously, they are a bigger company. They charge more for their wine. They have invested a lot. They're owned by Jadot, so they have got some money behind them, and they use a mixture of the foudre, which I referred to a moment ago, and these stainless steel tanks. So I just wanted to highlight the different receptacles and the different aging vats that you can use for Beaujolais. But generally, you don't want the wines to taste woody. You're wanting the fruit to come through more than anything. So what are the typical characteristics of Moulin Avant? Moulin Avant the wines are more powerful than Fleury. They're the other end of the spectrum, really. They're structured, they're complex, they're spicy, there's a kind of dark fruit character. Spicy maybe when they're a bit older. They're more violets and cherries when the wines are young. But Moulin Avant wines are the wines that age best in Beaujolais. So there are certain wines which you can keep for 10 years quite happily if they're made in a style that is appropriate, and if they're from good old vines in good vineyards. I did say that you don't really want to taste wood in Beaujolais. Well, the one cru that can really take oak is Moulin Avant. And sometimes you'll taste a young Moulin Avant that has got a little bit of oak flavor, and that dissipates in time. But because the wines are the most structured of all, they can actually take a bit of oak. I've got a very interesting anecdote which I wanted to share with you about Moulin Avant, because Moulin Avant historically was the top cru in Beaujolais, and many will argue that it still is the top cru. But the wines back in the day commanded the same prices as some of the top wines from Burgundy. And I heard a very interesting anecdote recently about a guy called Henri Mommessin, who was a negociant trader in Beaujolais in the 30s. And he went up to Beaune because he wanted to go to an auction of vineyards, because he wanted to buy some Moulin Avant. He wanted to increase his holdings in Moulin Avant, which at the time was the great vineyard of Beaujolais. And anyway, a friend the next day bumped into him in the street back in Beaujolais and said, "You look glum. What's the problem?" And he looked a bit down in the mouth. And apparently he said that he'd been up to Beaune the day before to buy some vineyard and was very disappointed because he didn't manage to pick up the vineyard that he was wanting to buy from Moulin Avant. But for the same price, he bought some Clos de Tar. Well, for anyone who knows, Clos de Tar is one of the most sought after vineyards in Burgundy. A hectare of Moulin Avant these days that's well placed and planted with vines might cost about 100,000 euros for a hectare. But if you wanted to buy Clos de Tar, that's about 35 million pounds for a hectare. So that kind of tells you how things have moved on in Burgundy, but not in Beaujolais. So anyway, I thought I'd just share that with you. So the basic idea about Moulin Avant is that the wines have structure, a bit of grit, and that they are keepers. So I'm tasting the Moulin Avant Les Torrents from Philippe Guérin, who I mentioned earlier. He's the guy that had the soil profile. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see a picture of Philippe opening a bottle for me when I visited him a while ago.
And talking of structure, Tim, because often when we're talking about wines in general, the structure comes from the acidity and from the tannin. But obviously, Gamay as a grape is very low in tannin.
Yeah.
So what is it about the Gamay grown in Moulin Avant that means it has that structure in comparison?
Well, I think the wines undergo a longer process in maceration, so they do pick up a little bit more tannin than wines from other parts of the cru. And I think it's also partly the soils which lend themselves to this kind of minerality. People talk about minerality. It's a controversial word, minerality, but it does kind of encapsulate some of the kind of more earthy and mineral I've said it, mineral characteristics of certain wines. And I do think that Moulin Avant and also Morgon, that we're going to come to, do have a certain minerality. Les Torrens, which is where the wine I'm tasting comes from, Les Torrens was historically a place that had manganese wines, and some people say that that's what lends the wine its minerality. I can't believe that you can taste manganese, but that's what some people say anyway. So I think it's a mixture of winemaking and soil, to answer the question, Catherine.
Perfect, thank you.
So that's Moulin Avant in a nutshell. It is an interesting area, and it's got a diverse soil, as we saw earlier. We're going to be doing, to give you a kind of heads up, we're going to be offering the Moulin Avant's 2020 vintage Moulin Avant from Château des Jacques en primeur. So in August, we're going to be doing an offer of 2020 vintage wines. So they are some of the longest keeping wines in the whole of Beaujolais, and they are, well, I think we're offering 4 Moulin Avant and 1 Morgon, because they have great vineyards and they make wines to keep. So I think it justifies offering en primeur. Lovely. Okay, next wine, Morgon. So I love the wines of Morgon, and particularly the wines of one particular producer, JeanMarc Burgos. He produces wines of real finesse and real class. He's, I think we can actually go on to, there we go. So this is a picture taken in winter in the Côte du Py vineyard in Morgon, which is the top vineyard in Morgon. It's just relatively high up and has kind of slaty, schisty soils. And actually, if you look very closely in the foreground, you can see what looks like lumps of kind of schist. I think those are lumps of schist. I'm kind of screwing my eyes up to see, but I think they are, yes. And that is a vineyard that produces the top Morgon. There's a picture of me with JeanMarc Burgos, so the chap I was referring to, and I think he makes absolutely sensational wines. We always sell out of his wines, but I've managed to get a big allocation this year, and I think we're offering his one of his Morgons at the moment, his Grand Crus. I hope we haven't sold out, but we will be offering his Côte du Py later in the year if you want his top wine. The particular style of Morgon is kind of fleshy, quite dense, quite powerful. The kind of fruit flavors you get are kind of stone fruits, kirsch, that kind of thing. Spicy. There is a bit of structure there. His wines age incredibly well. So if you maybe if we can go on to the next slide, there's a picture of me with JeanMarc, and he whenever you go and taste in his cellar, he opens all his bottles from the latest vintage, and then he gets very excited and starts saying, "Would you like to taste something a bit older?" Yes is always the answer. And when I visited him last time, you can just about make out he gave me a 1997 to taste, which is a good but not great vintage, and it was just proof that his wines can really keep well, and they are beautiful wines. And if you can see, next to the bottle of 1997 is a Magnum. That is a Magnum of 1992 Morgon Côte du Py that he opened, and 1992 was apparently a terrible vintage. but the wine was sensational. It was amazing. And the wines tend to take on almost a Burgundian quality. So the older the wine is, the more it starts to resemble Pinot Noir. It's quite interesting. And, you know, if I'd been given the wine blind, not knowing that it was one of JeanMarc's wines, I'd have put it in Burgundy. So if you do hold on to these wines for quite a long time, then they do take on this kind of Pinot Noir character. I mean, I set the drink windows for all the wines that we sell at the Wine Society, and I tend to be quite conservative. So a lot of the wines, even if they're beyond their drink date, they will drink beautifully. I mean, a 1992 Magnum of Morgon Côte de Pie, you would have expected to have curled up and died, but it certainly hadn't.
I'm very jealous because that's my birth year. And
oh, is it?
There's nothing else that is drinkable, really.
Well, it's very good for white Burgundy as well. So if you ever came across some white Burgundy, but it's probably horrendously expensive now, I would imagine.
But you mentioned, just going back to sort of the aromas you got, so you flavors, you were mentioning Kirsch. I was interested because we've had a few questions about carbonic maceration. Kirsch is one of those flavor profiles that can indicate some carbonic maceration.
Yes.
Is that something that you see in the Crus? Because obviously I think we're all familiar perhaps with Beaujolais.
Well, let me just explain what carbonic maceration is for people who haven't heard of it before. Beaujolais has a not unique but a very particular way of making wines. Not everybody uses it, but a lot of people use it, and it's called carbonic maceration, or most people use something called semi-carbonic maceration. I don't want to go into the technicalities too much, but basically what happens is that you chuck your grapes into a big tank. You tend not to take them off basically you chuck whole bunches into the fermenter. You don't destem them. And then you put a lid on the tank or on the fermenter, and the weight of the grapes means that the grapes at the bottom start to puncture, and they start to produce carbon dioxide. In other words, they start to ferment, and that produces carbon dioxide, which produces this kind of anaerobic atmosphere. I am getting a bit technical, sorry. Within the fermenter, and what happens is that you get this kind of fermentation. The grapes that weren't pierced, so the ones that are higher up, start to actually ferment within the grapes. So it's called intracellular fermentation. I know, it is a bit technical, but basically the bottom line is that it ferments the wine, but it doesn't extract too much, so you're not getting too much tannin. So to answer your question, Catherine, yes, carbonic maceration is used quite a lot. It does give the wines softness, it makes them approachable, and it does give that kind of cherry kind of character. But I think the cherry character is also quite typical of the Gamay grape anyway. So how much of that is due to carbonic maceration, it's hard to say. Okay. Sorry, I just finished my glass of Morgon. That's lovely. Yeah. That'll go well with my sausages tonight. Okay. Right. So that is Morgon. I'm going to talk about Bruy now. So if we go on to the next slide, you will see a fantastic picture of the vineyards of Bruy. So in the foreground there, you can see these big old bush vines. You can't quite get a feel for how high up these vines are and how steep the slope is, but this is at the top of the vineyard of Domaine de Fontcuré, which is a small property, and it's right at the top of the Bruy vineyards. It's about 500 meters, which in Beaujolais terms is high. And of course, it's slightly cooler at that height. So you do get more of an expression of ripeness, more of an expression of that kind of cool climate Gamay than you do lower down. But Bruy is the biggest of all the Cru. It's the furthest south, and it produces wines that are kind of soft, round, fleshy, fruity. They're wines that don't keep particularly. They're best drunk relatively young, unlike Morgon or Moulin Avant. So they are. I mean, the soils are variable, but it's mainly granite soil, like much of Cru Beaujolais. There's a bit of limestone in there as well. But in the background, you can see a rather attractive-looking hill with some trees on the top. That is Montbrouilly. So the vineyards of Bruy are kind of surround Montbrouilly, and Montbrouilly is an extinct volcano which has obviously volcanic soils, and that produces a more serious style of wine for longer keeping. Montbrouilly is a much smaller appellation. I think it's around 300 hectares, whereas Bruy itself is 1,200, over 1,200 hectares. I think it's 1,250 hectares. So it's actually Bruy is a sizable Cru, but it produces pleasure wines. They are lovely wines, and we sell quite a lot of Bruy. I would say in the pecking order of sales, Bruy comes after, or is on a par with Morgon. Fond Curé being something that we buy pretty much every year because they're consistently good. So that is Bruy. I do have this is the Bruy that we're selling at the moment. This is the Fond Curé wine, which is actually from where the vineyard that you've just seen. And that's a nice, fruity, easy drinking style from the 2018 vintage. The 2020 vintage I tasted the other day and approved, and will be selling it later in the year, and it's lovely as well. So they do produce consistently good wines. So that's Bruy and Côte de Bruy. I'm conscious that we have only 15 minutes left, so I'd like to leave a little bit of time for some questions. So the next wine that I'd like to talk about is Chirouble. And Chirouble is the highest elevation and one of the smallest appellations. So Chirouble is an appellation that I feel very strongly about. So we talked about climate change earlier, and for me, Chirouble has this fantastic, because of its elevation, it produces wines that really are typical of the Gamay grade, even in hot vintages. And of course, there are more and more hot vintages. You can see it's just to the kind of southwest of Fleury. And it produces wines, as I say, in hot vintages that are lovely and perfumed. And they're not wines for long keeping, but they are lovely and fresh and appetizing. I'm just trying to think. In the olden days, Chirouble, the wines, because of the climate, struggled actually to ripen, and that's why it's never become a particularly popular appellation. But I feel very strongly that Chirouble is one of the unsung heroes of the Beaujolais Cru, and I think it'll become more and more popular. And I'm keen to push the Chirouble Cru particularly. The vineyards are very, very steep, so the people who make Chirouble are real. I mean, the wines, A, they are not easy to sell because nobody's heard of Chirouble, and B, the vineyards are very, very steep. So they have a really literally an uphill struggle to continue. And that's why I would like, as a buyer at the Wine Society, to support Chirouble, the appellation, because I really believe in it. And I think in future it's going to be more and more popular. Okay. So that's Chirouble. Régnier is on the map. You can see kind of a bit further south from Chirouble. It's kind of it's got Morgon just north of it. Régnier is probably one of the least known because of the Cru because it's the youngest. I think it became a Cru officially in 1990 or thereabouts. Quite often you don't see the wine labelled as Régnier. It's often labelled as Beaujolais Village, unfortunately, because it's often easier to sell it as Beaujolais Village than Régnier. And the style of the wines tend to be refreshing, nice bright fruit, again, cherries, easy drinking, aromatic wines, not particularly for the long term, but they are very, very decent wines. And the prices of Régnier are not excessive, and therefore we, I like to buy Régnier, support the vigneron of that Cru, but also it's great value for members, Régnier, because the price is virtually the same as some Beaujolais Village. Okay, 3 more Cru to do, and I'll cover them very quickly. You can see Juliana right at the top, and Saint-Amour also right at the top. Juliana is a historic area. It's got some quite steep slopes, kind of schistous soils. It produces wines that are kind of fleshy and quite expressive, and they can keep. So you can, particularly from the steepest vineyards, the wines are keepers, and they do have a little bit of structure. So I don't buy Juliana every year, but in good vintages, when the grapes are nice and ripe, it produces some very attractive wines. Again, the prices are not silly, so can always keep a lookout for that. There's a vineyard called Les Capitans in Juliana, which produces particularly good wines. So if you see Juliana Les Capitans, it's well worth a punt, I would say. Saint-Amour, almost unknown. It's a very small appellation. The wines mainly sell in France. Saint-Amour mainly sells at Valentine's Day for obvious reasons, amour meaning love. So you don't really see it much in this country. It does make 2 styles of wines. There are some serious wines from Saint-Amour, and we do the one from Chateau de Beauregard, which we'll be offering, I think, next month. So you could keep a lookout for that if you want a more serious style of Saint-Amour. But if you want a more fruity style, they also exist. And when I buy the wines, I try to make it clear in the tasting notes whether the wine is in the kind of soft, fruity, easy drinking style or in the more serious, structured, keeping style. So that's Saint-Amour. And the last one, last but not least, is Chenin. So Chenin is the smallest of the Cru, one of the least known. Again, you don't always see it labeled as Chenin, but there are some very, very good wines. Again, I try and support the Chenin growers by offering members some good options from that particular part of the world. The wines tend to be harmonious and fruity. They are relatively easy drinking, but there are some that will keep well. And we do one from Stéphane Aveyron made from old vines. And that's a wine that will keep really, really well. So that's Chenin. Well worth looking at, particularly if it's from a warmer vintage. And that's it, a whistle-stop tour of the 10 Cru.
Excellent, thank you, Tim. It was whistle-stop, but it was a great covering of everything and how the nuances are there. And, you can find a lot of variation and a lot of different Beaujolais for different tastes. So thank you. We have had some questions that are a little bit more general, so they don't sort of refer specifically to one Cru or another. But I think perhaps the first question to start with is quite an interesting one from Roger Mackenzie. He's asking whether there are other varieties grown in the region that with climate change would actually perform better, and is that something that we'll see? But I imagine it would sound strange to have a Beaujolais Cru wine made with something other than Gamay. I mean, are there changes afoot? Or
no, there are no changes afoot. I think the thing about Gamay is that it is so distinctive. I mean, there's nowhere else really in the world that produces Gamay as characterful as in Beaujolais. And I think if you you started planting Syrah or you started planting Grenache, the region would just lose its character. So I think what the vignerons are trying to do is they're trying to find ways of combating climate change in the way that they in their vineyard management. So they might keep more foliage on the leaves to protect the bunches. They might pick earlier. But I think if you actually started planting other vines, then I think that would be the slippery slope, and that would be the end of Beaujolais. I mean, there is one producer who's a bit of a maverick called Jean-Paul Brun down in the south, who makes great wines, and he has got odd plantings of non Gamay varieties, but he doesn't sell them as Beaujolais, obviously. But it's more experimental than anything else, and he's even got some Marsanne and some weird and wonderful stuff. But generally, I think everybody realizes in Beaujolais that they have to find a way for the Gamay grape to work.
And that quite leads me quite nicely into the next question, which is from Richard Wyndham, and he's asking whether the style is affected by the cru or the grower or winemaker. So I suppose the question there is, how much flexibility do the growers and winemakers have to be that little bit more experimental to the cru that they're in?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that is the essence of, it's the same in Burgundy. How much is it the village and the soil in that village or in that vineyard that influences the style of the wine, and how much is it the winemaker? And the simple answer is it's both. Any good winemaker tries to make a wine that expresses the soil and the terroir from which it comes, but also tries to put their stamp on it, if you like. So it really is a mixture of the two. I mean, if you gave me a lineup of 3 Beaujolais and said one is a Moulin Avant, one is a Fleury, one is a Morgon, if they were typical of the styles that I've told you about, I would probably be able to pick them. But if you try to pull a fast one and have wines that were not necessarily typical of the appellation or the cru, because that winemaker is not necessarily making wines that are typical of that cru, then I wouldn't obviously be able to identify them. So it's a mixture, basically.
Yeah. And with those sort of changes happening, and perhaps the changes in like the modernity in winemaking, we've had a question from Justin Douglas asking, what trends are we seeing in Beaujolais in terms of a shift towards more sustainable or organic viticulture? And I suppose the other question is, are we seeing a shift towards that as a trend?
Yes, we are, absolutely. So Beaujolais is one of the areas of France that has embraced low sulfur wines and natural wines and organic viticulture. I mean, of the growers that I was talking about tonight, so I talked about Grégoire Popinot, the newcomer who's making such great wines. He's switching all his vineyards gradually to organic viticulture. It is a risk, but I think in somewhere like Beaujolais, which is not too humid typically, and there's plenty of wind, it is possible to make organic wines more easily than in somewhere like Bordeaux, which has got a more humid climate, and therefore it's more difficult to make wines without spraying them. So Grégoire is making, he's transitioning to organic. There are other producers like Philippe Guérin, the guy in Moulin Avant that I mentioned, who isn't going for organic viticultural. He's not going for official certification, but he is using organic practices. Obviously, if there is an outbreak of mildew, he feels it's better to have the option of spraying the vines, because otherwise he could potentially lose all his crop. So there are a lot of people who are, whilst they're not officially organic, they are practicing a lot of organic techniques. And there are other certifications that people are getting on board with. There's one called Haute Valeur Environnementale, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's called HVE, and that's people who have a whole sustainable approach to all their vineyards, not just in the winery, not just the vineyards. It's, water management, it's a whole host of different facets, and a lot of people are doing that as well. So there are more and more people, I think, in France in general, but Beaujolais is certainly an area that's at the cutting edge of organic viticulture.
I suppose not reducing it too much, because obviously it's a huge undertaking, but it's not too dissimilar to what we as general consumers are doing with, our spending habits and our buying habits. We're looking for more sustainable packaging, that sort of thing.
Yes.
But it's nice to have flexibility that if you need to, sometimes for convenience or for in this case, for the security of your crop, you're going to need to use things
and the security of your livelihood. And I do hear these horror stories about people who are fully organic and are sticking to that 100%, because as soon as you spray the vines, then you have to go back to square one in your organic certification. But if your family is dependent on a few hectares of vines and you get mildew or rot, then that potentially wipes out your whole crop. So it is a big risk, particularly, as I say, in areas that are humid like Bordeaux. So that's why fewer people in Bordeaux and certain other areas of France practice fully certified organic viticulture, because it's too much of a risk.
Yeah, lovely. So we've had a couple of questions that I'm going to sort of combine because they are sort of similar, maybe two ends of the same question. So it's a question of where you think the best value cru would be, and also perhaps why Fleury is the most popular, and is that in turn the best value?
So Fleury is popular because of the style of the wine, which is easy drinking and floral and elegant and lovely and appetizing. But I think Fleury has partly become famous because of the name, which is easy to pronounce, and it also conjures up a lovely floral kind of character. And also, I think because Georges Duboeuf, probably, who was very much instrumental in putting Fleury on the map. Some of the biggest purchases that Georges Duboeuf made of vines and or wine was in Fleury, and so I think it's a combination of things. But it is easy to pronounce. I mean, when you get to Chirouble and you get to Régnier and certain other cru, it's and it's harder to get your false teeth around them. Then it's Fleury is relatively easy to pronounce. But I think it's really to do with the style of the wine that's been instrumental in making it popular. In terms of the best value, I would say that some of the lesser known cru offer great value. So I've talked about Régnier, I've talked about Chenin, I've talked about Chirouble. We work with growers at all kind of price levels for Beaujolais, but I think overall Beaujolais is incredibly good value, because you're getting even the most expensive Beaujolais. You rarely see a Beaujolais over £20 and never over, well, virtually never over £25. Think about Burgundy further north. You're getting handmade wines there, but you're paying 50, 60, £70 a bottle plus quite easily. So I think value for money wise, Beaujolais offers extraordinary value. And we're seeing sales of Beaujolais increase very rapidly. And I think a lot of that is due to people who literally can't afford now to buy red Burgundy. And I'm one of those people. I'm horrified by the prices now that red Burgundy commands. And good luck to them if they can command those prices. But I think Beaujolais, knocks Burgundy into a cocked hat when it comes to value for money.
Absolutely, excellent. And I think a nice question to just end on is how best to enjoy your Beaujolais. We've had a couple of questions on decanting and the temperature. I know you're a fan of decanting wines.
Pretty much everything I decant, yes, yeah.
And obviously we're getting into warmer weather, hopefully. So Beaujolais is one of the wines that you can drink a little bit cooler as a red.
Yes, absolutely. Cellar temperature, particularly for Beaujolais and Beaujolais Village. In summer, I stick it into the fridge for 20 minutes and it does bring out the lovely elegance of the wines. Cru Beaujolais, maybe not quite as cold. It can be drunk relatively, so I guess that's cellar temperature plus. Beaujolais and Beaujolais Village you can have quite happily as an aperitif or, as a picnic wine, that kind of thing. The Cru are a bit more serious and more at market, and those go very well with food. So, poulet de Bresse or, even hearty stews and that kind of things when you're getting into a kind of full moulin avant, that kind of thing. But they are very versatile when it comes to food. And actually, for a lighter, more fruity style like a fleury, you can very easily, have that with fish, particularly if it's like a poached salmon or tuna or something like that. It's lovely with fish.
Perfect. So I think that brings us nicely to a close, and we're all ready for dinner. So thank you, Tim. That was an excellent hour. I think, and I hope members will agree with me, that I think your passion for Beaujolais is so infectious, and I think we're in real good stead as members for the Wine Society. That we've seen the rise in popularity, and that's only going to increase. And we're in the position that we're going to get the best of it because you're the one searching for them for us.
Well, I'm delighted to be buying Beaujolais. Thank you. Yes, when I was allocated Beaujolais as a region, I have to say I was thrilled because I personally love the wines. I drink them a lot at home. And yes, well, thanks to members. Thanks to everybody it was great to have such a good turnout for a Beaujolais webinar. When somebody told me that the 500 people had signed up, I almost fell off my chair, but I'm delighted that there's so much interest in the wines. Thanks to you, Catherine, and also to Anna and to Gil behind the scenes for all the tech stuff. So great.
Thanks very much. Thank you, members.
Buy lots of Beaujolais. Thank you.
Absolutely. Cheers. Good evening.
Cheers.